بسم الله الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. The story of fiqh. This is, I believe, our seventh class on the story of fiqh. And alhamdulillah, we've covered quite a bit of time. The most important probably time for the history of fiqh, and that's basically the time of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. After having some kind of a background of religion before that, and then talking about the Meccan period, the period in Medina, and lastly we talked about the era of the companions, which is basically during Al-Khilafah Al-Rashida, during the time or the reign of the four rightly guided caliphs. Something to close with about this era, which is of the Khulafa Al-Rashidun, is basically one very important thing, because we will find from the companions and even from later generations a condemnation of ar-ra'i. Ar-ra'i is the use of intellect, when it comes to matters of fiqh and sharia. So we will find a condemnation of ar-ra'i, and we will also, at the same time, we find that they themselves have resorted to ijtihad, which is an intellectual endeavor. So how can we reconcile? So the companions, they had ar-ra'i among them, but they also condemned ar-ra'i, the use of intellect. How can we reconcile this? I believe we touched on this briefly, but it's good to just talk about it at the beginning here and make it a very clear point or station in this journey as we are talking about the history of fiqh. Generally speaking, ar-ra'i, or the use of intellect in finding out matters of fiqh or arriving at a conclusion in fiqh, is condemned when ar-ra'i, or the use of intellect, goes against an-nas, against the religious text. So when we have an opinion that goes clearly against the text, the Quranic text or the hadith, prophetic text, then this ra'i is condemned, is not acceptable, and is rejected, and has no place in Islam. Number two, ar-ra'i is also condemned when it is baseless, meaning when the person is coming up with their own opinions, when they don't have any foundational knowledge, proper foundational knowledge to do ijtihad. So a person might come up with an opinion, or this is how the ruling should be, and the ruling might be correct, the conclusion might be correct. But if this person has no grounds, hasn't mastered the tools of al-fiqh and usul al-fiqh, then even if his opinion or his conclusion is right, it's still condemned. Because this is the use of opinion without reference and without proper foundation from the Quran and the Sunnah, from someone who's not qualified. That's, generally speaking, when ar-ra'i is condemned. But ar-ra'i is accepted, and sometimes it's actually wajib and obligatory, is when there is a situation that there is no apparent and clear-cut, straightforward text about it. We have a newly arising situation. It's never been there before. And it requires the people who are qualified, the people who have mastered fiqh and mastered the usul al-fiqh, and they've mastered the tools of ijtihad, so they know al-ijma', for example, they know the consensus of the scholars. They are very well versed in the opinions of the scholars that are based on the text. It becomes obligatory that these people use ijtihad in order to handle such affairs. And that's the kind of opinion that we found among the companions, radiyallahu anhum. And we will see, inshallah, later on, this was the case with the tabi'een and the scholars who came afterwards. So that's, generally speaking, when ar-ra'i is condemned and when it is praiseworthy. So it's not completely condemned and it's not completely praiseworthy. So the use of intellect has a place in Islam, has a place for someone who understands the texts and their meanings, basically to use that understanding and the mastery of the tools in order to provide answers for situations we're faced with today. And this is why the scholars are making ijtihad until today. Second thing is, it's worth knowing the companions that actually stood out when it came to knowledge, because not all the companions were scholars. Not all the companions were scholars. Actually, a minority among the companions were scholars, as Imam Ibn al-Qayyim says at the beginning of his book, I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in. And he's probably the best one who's given that's the best kind of description or summary of the history of the scholars of Islam. At the beginning of his book, I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in, Imam Ibn al-Qayyim talks about each era of the Muslim history and the scholars there. So he mentions them by name from all generations. He mentions hundreds, probably it reaches thousands of names at each level, at each stage. So about the companions, radiyallahu anhum, not all of them were fuqaha, or not all of them were engaged in fiqh and making fatawa. Not all of them left a huge or a big legacy in terms of fiqh or heritage in terms of fiqh. There were 7 among the companions that are called al-mukthirun. Al-mukthirun. They had abundance in terms of fatawa, in terms of opinions, in terms of understanding, in terms of fiqh. They left behind a huge amount of fiqh. They call them al-mukthirun. They've left abundance of fiqh behind them. Whether it's a narration from the Prophet ﷺ, but not only a narration with an understanding of it and how to implement it. These are also mentioned by Ibn al-Qayyim in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in. The ones that are called al-Mukthirun, they are 7. Umar ibn Khattab. And you will recognize their names because their names always come up when we talk about fiqh and fiqh opinions. Ali ibn Abi Talib, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Aisha, al-Mu'mineen, radiyallahu anha, Zayd ibn Thabit, Abdullah ibn Abbas, wa Abdullah ibn Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiyallahu anhuma. These are 7. Again, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, wa Aisha, wa Zayd ibn Thabit, wa Abdullah ibn Abbas, wa Abdullah ibn Umar. Anas bin Malik. He wasn't from the Mukthirun, but he's from the ones in the, roughly probably he was one of the narrators of hadith, more. These are the fuqaha that basically people used to come to them for fatwa. So they had a lot of fatawa. And they faced a lot of situations and they used ijtihad. So these are not only narrators of hadith, because otherwise it would be if it's just narrators of hadith, Abu Hurairah would come first. Because Abu Hurairah narrated more than 5,000. Some estimates say that he actually narrated about 5,400, almost 5,400 hadith. So he would come first. But this is not about narrations of hadith, because Abu Hurairah just used to relate hadith. But these are the fuqaha who are called al-qurra. These are the most learned among the companions. And this classification is based on the amount of fatawa they produced. This is why Ibn Hazm, for example, he said about these 7, the first 7, he says, لو جمعت فتاوى كل واحد منهم لكانت صفرا ضخما. If the fatawa of each one of those were to be compiled in a book, it would create a huge file. Each one of those 7. There's another group of them which is intermediate, متوسطون, المتوسطون في الفتوى. المتوسطون في الفتوى. These are in the middle. So they had a good body of fiqh and fatawa, but they were still less than the al-mukthirun, the 7. Al-mutawassitun, from amongst the most notable among them was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu, Salama radiyallahu anha, Uthman ibn Affan, رضي الله عنه وأبو سعيد الخدري وأبو موسى الأشعري وجابر بن عبد الله ومعاذ بن جبل وعبد الله بن عمرو بن العاص وعبد الله بن الزبير. I'll repeat them. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Salama, Uthman ibn Affan, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, Jabir ibn Abdullah, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, wa Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr. And there are some of the companions who were actually fuqaha, but they left very little legacy in terms of fiqh. They were among the qurra. They were among the qurra, among the most learned and most educated and most knowledgeable among the companions, yet not so much was narrated from them in terms of like the volume of their fatwa. It was Abu Darda wa Abu Ubaidah عامر بن الجراح النعمان بن بشير أبي بن كعب أبو طلحة أبو ذر الغفاري صفية وحفصة وأم حبيبة. These are females, the last ones. You can see the wives of the Prophet ﷺ are among the most learned, and the ones who left a good number of fatwa. Aisha radiallahu anha is from the al-mukthirun, the ones who had a lot of fatwa, a lot of fiqhi or legal heritage. They left it behind. The last group, they are called al-muqillun. Al-muqillun. They left little, although they were very learned companions. They were fuqaha among the companions. Generally speaking, that sort of closes what we wanted to say about that stage of Al-Khulafa Ar-Rashidun, how fiqh developed and what the state of fiqh was at the time. Roughly speaking, from the year 11 after Hijrah till the year 40. To the year 40 after Hijrah, at the time Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu was murdered. Anyone knows who assassinated Ali ibn Abi Talib? Abdul Rahman ibn Muljim. Yes, Abdul Rahman ibn Muljim. He was from the Khawarij. Abdul Rahman ibn Muljim. Okay, now we move on to the next phase in fiqh, the development of fiqh. And that's basically from this point on, from the death of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, which is the year 40 after Hijrah, till almost the last stages of Al-Khilaf Al-Umayyah, the Umayyad Caliphate, which lived for about 100 years. So the Umayyad Caliphate remained for about 100 years. As it started to deteriorate and lose power, then the Al-Khilaf Al-Abbasiyya, the Abbasid Caliphate, started taking power. So this period was about 100 years. It was about 100 years. Although the last stages of Al-Khilaf Al-Umayyah, the last stages of the Umayyad Caliphate, let's say the last 20, 30 years, there was some new trend, specifically with Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah. So if we were to be more accurate, let's say this stage actually is from the year 40 after Hijrah till around 110 or 120, let's say 110 to 120. This would be more accurate for this stage. It would be more accurate. Dr. Bilal Phillips, I'm not sure how long he makes this one to be. 150 till the end of the Umayyad Caliphate. Okay, so anyway, and that's a classification, and it's basically a matter of opinion. It's a matter of opinion. So that's also, it's a good kind of let's say way to look at it, but still, because the last 30 years of the Umayyad Caliphate, because rahimahullah, Abu Hanifa gained a lot of attention, and the fact that there were learned people in certain areas like Abu Hanifa, and then in Al-Iraq, then Imam Malik in Medina, and Al-Layth bin Sa'd in Egypt, and then what's his name in Asham, in Beirut, subhanallah. No. Al-Awza'i, Imam Al-Awza'i. Imam Al-Awza'i was in Asham. These were individuals where the fiqh of the companions and the tabi'een sort of gathered in these people. So because the knowledge was spread. But these people like Abu Hanifa, he got the knowledge of the people of Iraq. It all was gathered and collected with Abu Hanifa. So he mastered that, the knowledge of the people of Iraq, the companions who settled in Iraq, and then they taught their students who were tabi'een, and then their knowledge, all of it, gathered with Abu Hanifa. And so as well in Medina, the fuqaha of Medina, their knowledge was gathered by Imam Malik. So some kind of pattern was taking shape. It started with Abu Hanifa. So this is why it's good to mark the difference in that sense when it comes to the last 30 years in the Umayyad Khilafah. A lot of the references when they talk about this period specifically, they focus on the political state. They focus a lot on the political state because there was a huge shift in the political state. We know that Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan radiyallahu anhu, he was announced to be Khalifa in many of the Muslim lands at the time, whereas in other parts, Al-Hasan ibn Ali was given the bay'ah, was also given the bay'ah. But that ended ultimately with Al-Hasan ibn Ali radiyallahu anhu making a treaty or an agreement with Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan and giving him the Khilafah. And actually the Prophet ﷺ prophesied this. The Messenger ﷺ said, "Inna ibni hada sayyid. Inna ibni hada sayyid. وَسَيُصْلِحُ اللَّهُ بِهِ بَيْنَ فِئَتَيْنِ عَظِيمَتَيْنِ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ." And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this son of mine is Sayyid, is a noble man. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring two great parties from among the believers who were in a state of fight. Allah will bring them together through him. And that actually happened in the year 41 after Hijrah. So he gave the Khilafah to Muawiyah and he gave him the bay'ah. So Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, he became the Khalifa. Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan introduced something new, which was handing down the Khilafah to his son, Yazid. And this was a big shock to a lot of the even fuqaha. This was a big shock. But this was an ijtihad from Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan radiyallahu anhu. It was an ijtihad from him. And this is why when Muawiyah wanted to take the bay'ah for his son after him, even before his death, he wanted to take that bay'ah, Al-Husayn ibn Ali radiyallahu anhu refused that. Abdullah ibn Umar even tried to avoid that. Abdullah ibn Zubayr, they all left even Mecca. They left Mecca and they moved to Medina. But when Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan passed away and Yazid, his son Yazid, became the Khalifa, now there was a big turmoil. there was big turmoil. And the turmoil basically was a lot of the Muslims, or some areas among the Muslims, they refused to give Yazid the bay'ah. They refused to give him the bay'ah. From them was Abdullah ibn Zubayr in Mecca. From them was as well Al-Husayn ibn Ali radiyallahu anhuma. He marched to Al-Kufa because he was promised by the people of Iraq that they would support him. And Al-Husayn radiyallahu anhu was murdered. Abdullah ibn Zubayr as well was killed and was murdered. And Mecca was violated by Al-Hajjaj. Also Medina as well was violated. All of this in order to establish, the Khilafah of Yazid. And this is why the scholars say this wasn't Khilafah in the proper sense of the word. This was more of a kingship. This was mulk. This was kingship. This was a kingship. And the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that in a hadith. He said, تكون الخلافة فيكم 40 سنة. الخلافة تكون فيكم خلافة على منهاج النبوة 40 سنة. There will be khilafah upon the guidance of prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ 40 years. ثم يكون ملكا. Then it will become mulk, kingship. So it will become kings. So it will be a king handing down the position to his son or to his crown prince, whatever you want to call it, and so on and so forth. And this started with the Khilafah. The Khulafa of Bani Umayyah, they established their Khilafah often, and they faced a lot of resistance. And the way they dealt with it, oftentimes was with force. The main exception was Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah. And there was a lot of spread of the Muslim lands expanded at the time. There was a lot of futuhat, a lot of conquest taking place. Generally speaking, that's the state of, yes, this kind of Muawiyah taking the Khilafah and Al-Hasan handing over the Khilafah to Muawiyah, this created a lot of problems still. Although, alhamdulillah, it saved the Muslims a lot of warfare, but also created a lot of problems, specifically with the Khawarij. So the Khawarij they tried to fight against the Al-Khilafah Al-Umayyah, against Muawiyah, but Muawiyah was very good at handling them. Also the Shia who believed that the Khilafah should not be given to Abu Bakr and Umar. It was meant to be given to Ali ibn Abi Talib, and then it should remain in the progeny of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the descendants of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu. So they were resistant, but they were more quiet at the time. The Khawarij caused the biggest kind of turmoil and trouble. So these kind of groups, they appeared. So we have the Khawarij and we have the Shia. The Shia started to develop in terms of Aqeedah. They started to create new kind of ideas around their Aqeedah, around their Imams. And the Khawarij, they went to more extremes. Each one of them developed some kind of fiqh that is special for them. Specifically the Shia. The Shia developed a fiqh that is particular to them. That's peculiar to them. They are the only ones who have this kind of fiqh. They developed it. And the Khawarij, they were very strict. Something about the Khawarij, and you might find this a little bit funny, especially the extreme ones among the Khawarij. For them, if you engaged in any kind of evil, envy, let's say, you had an instant of envy towards someone, hasad. For them, this was an impurity. So if you engaged in envy, that would nullify your wudu. So you will have to make wudu. So they mix what they call the actions of the heart with the actions of the limbs, with the body. So they got to that stage. And the Khawarij would consider a person who involved, depending on the level of their extremity, but some of them considered any person who falls in a sin has committed disbelief. They have to become Muslim again, all over again. That's the extreme Khawarij. Some of them said no, only the sins where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where there's a curse from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or where there is a punishment, a prescribed punishment for it. So like for example, murder, committing zina. This is why some of them said no, it's the major sins. If you commit one of the major sins, you'll become a disbeliever. Anyway, so they developed their own fiqh, but this had an influence, had a big influence, but it wasn't really a direct influence on fiqh. Because the fiqh that the Shia developed, we're not concerned with it. The fiqh, the peculiar fiqh that the Khawarij developed, we're not even concerned with this. We're talking about the mainstream fiqh, which is the fiqh of Ahlul Sunnah. The fiqh of Ahlul Sunnah. The fiqh of Ahlul Sunnah was mainly affected by the factor that during the Khilafah of Umar al-Khattab, Umar tried to keep the most knowledgeable among the companions in Medina. He tried to keep them in Medina. Why? Because he wanted them to be there to be his advisors, to be his main advisors. So he would consult with them, he would take their opinion, he would listen to what narrations they had, and so on and so forth. But still, in order to run the affairs of the expanding Muslim state at the time, he needed to send some of them out. So he sent, for example, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, he sent Mu'adh ibn Jabal, he sent Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he sent other companions here and there in order to teach people. He sent, for example, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud to Al-Kufa, or to Iraq. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud settled in Al-Kufa. And the majority of the companions were in Medina. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud settled in Al-Kufa. With him, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari was in Al-Basra. There is something about the companions that we need to understand. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of the most learned among the companions, and we saw that he was one of the ones who had a huge number of fatwa. Yet he was a big fan of Umar ibn al-Khattab. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was a big admirer of the fiqh of Umar ibn al-Khattab, and he said, "Ma ra'aytu afqaha min Umar." I haven't seen anyone who was more fiqh than Umar. And he said, "Ma uhibbu an ukhalif ibn al-Khattab." I don't like to take an opinion other than the one that Umar al-Khattab has. And it wasn't a biased kind of admiration, no, but it was, he saw a lot of wisdom and he saw a lot of understanding of the text in Umar al-Khattab. And we saw Umar al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu was more, I would say, although that's a bit, okay, sometimes we need to be careful with the words because sometimes they might be misinterpreted. Umar al-Khattab was more liberal with ijtihad than Abu Bakr radiyallahu anhu. Umar al-Khattab was more liberal with ijtihad, with ra'i, an opinion, than Abu Bakr radiyallahu anhu. Abu Bakr would stay with the text to the letter. Umar al-Khattab, he would come up with a new idea. Like for example, let's get the Quran in one collection. When he became the Khalifa, we know that in Am al-Ramada, he did not implement the punishments, especially for theft. He got, like from Fatima bint Qais, she had a case with the Prophet ﷺ. She explained to him he did not accept her own narration based on his own assessment. He had a certain assessment based on certain clues at the time. And Umar ibn Khattab, initiated a lot of opinions because during his time, newly arising situations were more abundant and more common than the times of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So Umar al-Khattab was more liberal when it came to ijtihad. He exercised much more ijtihad than Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud traveled to, we said, to Iraq. He settled in Al-Kufa as soon as it was built. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, the people in Iraq, the tabi'in in Iraq, they studied with Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So he was their teacher. So the fiqh of the people of Iraq is the fiqh of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, influenced greatly by Umar ibn Khattab, radiyallahu anhum jami'an. This is a very important thing. In the Hijaz, in Medina, who was there? It was Abdullah ibn Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu. These are the ones who remained afterwards, like the ones who lived long from among the companions after the death of Ali ibn Abi Talib. There is Abdullah ibn Umar. There is Abdullah ibn Abbas. There is Mu'adh ibn Jabal. These companions were less in favor of ijtihad, but they were more leaning to holding on to the text regardless. This is why Abdullah ibn Umar radiyallahu anhu, he used to do everything the Prophet, even any place he heard or he knew that the Prophet ﷺ prayed in, he would go and pray in that spot. Anything the Prophet ﷺ did, the way the Prophet ﷺ dyed his beard or his hair, he would dye with the same colors. He even heard that the Messenger ﷺ urinated in the shade of one tree one day. So he made it a point to go to that tree and urinate there. That was Abdullah ibn Umar radiyallahu anhuma. He was a very keen follower of everything the Prophet ﷺ did. So he was trying to follow to the letter. So this is why in Medina, the fiqh in Medina, during the time of the Tabi'een and the later ones of the companions, two schools of thought emerged. The one in Iraq being influenced greatly by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and the one in Medina that was greatly influenced by Abdullah ibn Umar and Abdullah ibn Abbas mainly. So they later on developed to be called in Iraq Madrasatul Ra'i, a school of thought of using intellect. That was the main thing about it, of using intellect. And we'll get inshallah some of their names as well. So in Medina, it was called Madrasatul Al-Hadith. Madrasatul Hadith. The focus was on the narrations from the Prophet ﷺ, and if they faced a situation that they don't have a clear text about, they would not even give a fatwa most of the time. They would even not give a fatwa. They would even not give a fatwa. But in Iraq, whatever narrations they had, they would refer to them. But when they had certain things, certain fatwa that they need to make, and they had no text, no hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, they would use ijtihad. This is why one of them, and I think it's Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, he said, إني لأسمع الحديث فأقيس منه 40 مسألة. He said, I hear the hadith, and by using analogy, I managed to infer and to take from this hadith 40 fiqhi issues by means of analogy, by means of using analogy, al-qiyas. So they were obsessed with this. Even like one of the most famous catchphrases they had, they would, for example, mention al-khamr. Al-khamr was haram. So they say al-khamr is haram. Kullu muskirin haram. So they would, what if khamr, okay, some type of khamr, they would say what if. Ara'ayta means what if. Okay, ara'ayta, what if. What if there is a khamr that's made, but you need to drink a whole barrel to become intoxicated? And if you, like for example, drink 2 liters, 5 liters, you won't be intoxicated. So they would start coming up with hypotheses. What if this happens? What if this happens? So they would say, Ara'ayta, what if this happens? This is why in Medina they used to call the people of Iraq Al-Ara'aytiyun. Al-Ara'aytiyun. Okay? The what ifs. Well, these are the what ifs. The what? Ifers, the ifers, yeah, if. So anything that happens, what if this? Or what about this case? What about that case? What about that case? They like to use analogy and find out. So they would come up with scenarios that were non-existent, but they just thought of them. The could possibly happen, and they would try to understand the ruling by means of that. By means of that. This is why, for example, one of the students of Sa'id ibn Musayyib was Rabi'a. Rabi'a was in Medina. He's one of the teachers of Imam Malik. Rabi'a was named Rabi'at al-Ra'i. معروف Rabi'at al-Ra'i. Why? The Rabi'a of opinion, Rabi'a of intellect. Why? Because he used to ask the a lot of the a lot of these, what if this, why is this, why is that? So they called him in Medina Rabi'at al-Ra'i. So he was asking one of his teachers a lot of questions. His teacher said to him, "Iraqiyun anta? Are you from Iraq?" Obviously by means of joke. Are you from Iraq? Because that's what the people in Iraq do. Here we say, what's the narration? What did the Prophet ﷺ say? What did the companions radiyallahu anhum say? This happened by means of the fact that the companions spread all over the different parts of the newly Muslim lands. So they spread all over these countries. And any companion who arrived, like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, had a number of ahadith, but he did not memorize all the ahadith. He didn't know all the ahadith of the Prophet. So whatever he knew, he taught it to the people of Iraq. And the people of Iraq, obviously there were no airplanes, no buses, no telephones, no internet. So knowledge was local as well, was localized. Knowledge was local. So the matter of distance was a big factor in terms of the fragmentation of knowledge. So the people of Iraq, that's the knowledge of Islam they had. That came from Abdullah bin Mas'ud. In Sham, they had other companions, like Mu'adh ibn Jabal and others. So they had the knowledge that these companions carried. So there was now the knowledge of Iraq, the knowledge of Sham. In Egypt, there was another type of knowledge. Although Egypt had less of hadith, specifically at those early stages, there was less of hadith in Egypt. Yemen as well had another number of companions who had a different, probably not completely different, but slightly different set of hadith as well. So that was the knowledge of the people of Yemen. So this is why what you find here, you might not find there. But the most hadith remained in Medina. The most hadith remained in Medina. Let's see who the companions, where the companions, some of the most notable companions remained. We have in Mecca, Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhu was in Mecca. He settled finally in Mecca and he taught there in Mecca. And from the most notable of his students was Mujahid ibn Jabr, and Ata ibn Abi Rabah, the famous Mufassirin, wa Tawus bin Kaysan, Tawus ibn Kaysan. All of these had been previously slaves. In Medina, as we said, a huge number of companions who remained there. Zayd ibn Thabit remained there, and Abdullah ibn Umar at this stage, after year 40. Zayd ibn Thabit wa Abdullah ibn Umar, they remained in Medina. And they had a huge number of students. Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, Urwa ibn al-Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, and others as well that we will name them. They're called al-Fuqaha al-Sab'a. That's a very famous term. Al-Fuqaha al-Sab'a, the 7 Fuqaha of Medina. The 7 Fuqaha of Medina. After that, there was Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, the famous al-Zuhri, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. Al-Kufa. Ali ibn Abi Talib obviously settled in Al-Kufa and was murdered, but after that, there was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So Abdullah bin Mas'ud, his knowledge was taken fervently by the people of Iraq. And from his most notable students is Alqamah, والأسود ومسروق وشريح والشعبي والنخعي إبراهيم النخعي وسعيد بن جبير. Sa'id ibn Jubayr is the most notable among the Tabi'een. Sa'id ibn Jubayr, who was killed by Al-Hajjaj. These were in Al-Kufa, the students of Abdullah bin Mas'ud. In Al-Basra, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, obviously, and even Anas bin Malik settled in Al-Basra. Who are the students, most notable students of specifically Abu Musa al-Ash'ari? We have Abu al-Hasan al-Basri. Oh, sorry, it's Al-Hasan al-Basri. Yes, Al-Hasan al-Basri. We have Al-Hasan al-Basri, Muhammad ibn Sirin. Those are the most notable in Al-Basra. Al-Hasan al-Basri. In Al-Sham, was Mu'adh ibn Jabal from the companions who settled there, وعبادة بن الصامت وأبو الدرداء. Specifically Mu'adh bin Jabal. Mu'adh bin Jabal was the main teacher in Al-Sham. From their most notable students among the Tabi'een is Abu Idris al-Khawlani. Abu Idris al-Khawlani, Makhul al-Dimashqi, Umar bin Abd al-Aziz, Raja ibn Haywa. Slightly after them was Al-Imam al-Awza'i. Imam al-Awza'i. In Egypt, Masr, we know that Abdullah bin Amr bin al-As settled there because his father, Amr bin al-As, was the Emir of Egypt. So he settled in Egypt. But Amr bin al-As was busy with governance. He was busy in the political affairs. And this is why some of the Tabi'een, they said Amr bin al-As had a lot of knowledge, but a lot of it was wasted in the sense that was not taken by students. Students did not take advantage of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. Some of the Tabi'in actually estimate that he had 700 hadith. 700 hadith that most of the students that did not take. He had one notable student, and it was Yazid ibn Hubayb. Yazid ibn Hubayb is the teacher of Layth ibn Sa'd, the faqih of Egypt. Al-Yemen, some of the companions settled and they left. They settled and left, like Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, Mu'adh ibn Jabal. Among the most notable among the Tabi'een, the ones who learnt from the companions, were Mutarrif bin Mazin, wa Abd al-Razzaq ibn Hammam, wa Hisham ibn Yusuf. We'll come back to these two schools. So the main two schools of fiqh, they emerged first in Medina, Madrasatu Ahl al-Hadith, the school of thought of Ahl al-Hadith, and Madrasatu al-Ra'i fil Iraq, and the ones who were more intellectually oriented, and those intellectually oriented, yes, in Iraq. Something about this time, due to these political situations, the companions at an early stage before that started feeling the need to write down the hadith, document it. Umar ibn Khattab even thought about this. Umar ibn Khattab thought about this and he made a council with the companions. He asked them, what do you think about this? Then they advised that he actually does document the hadith. that they initiate an effort to document the hadith in books. So Umar al-Khattab radiallahu anhu made istikhara for a month. Then he decided not to do it. He decided not to do it. And the reason was he said, I don't want what happened to previous nations to happen to this nation. And basically these people got busy with, the stories that happened with their prophets to the point that they left much of the revelation. Much of the revelation. So he said, I don't want people to turn away from the Quran and start chasing the narrations, and they leave off the Quran completely. So he decided not to do it. The one who thought afterwards more seriously, and he falls within the era or the time that we're talking about, was Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. And he's the one who truly initiated the effort. So he actually sent to the emirs of the different Muslim lands to start collecting and documenting the hadith. And that was at the time of Umar bin Abdul Aziz. So some collections started emerging at his time. It was such a tremendous thing because you would take these narrations from individuals. These individuals memorized it and they had it documented in their own private notebooks. So how would you get this in such a vast country now, and at times when there is no means of communication apart from traveling? So it took a lot of years. It took about 50 years until the first collections started to appear. And the first collections that appeared, they were not, by the way, very well ordered. They were just collections of hadith. So you'll find one on zakah, you'll find one on, for example, hajj, next to each other. So just collections of hadith were put together. These were the early stages of the collection of hadith. During the times later on, that started in the later part of the Khilafah of Uthman ibn Affan, and then the Khilafah of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Then it got even worse after the death of Ali ibn Abi Talib, that everyone became very careful who they take the hadith from. Everyone became careful who they take the hadith from. Because people, due to their political affiliations, some people started to make up narrations. So at that specific time, the Muslims became very careful who they would take some hadith. And this is why the Muslims were very careful not to engage so much in hadith, because they wanted to limit the concept of hadith and the abundance of hadith to the people who know it. Because if it gets out of hand, a lot of people will enter that field. And then it would be very difficult to know who is who and who's saying what. So when it was, and this is why Umar al-Khattab decided not to do that, by the way. So when it was limited, there was no room for people to initiate some fabricated hadith. Because the people who had the hadith were known. These were the learned ones among the companions and their students among the tabi'een. So anyone who came up with a hadith would be found out quickly and would not be accepted. It would be such a very dangerous thing for someone to do. But then when the hadith started to be circulated more, obviously with that great number of people, so it was easier for anyone to blend into them and start making up hadith. So this was the point. So now there was a lot of attention. So they started to study the narrators of hadith, the isnad of hadith. This has to do with the fiqh, because we know the hadith is the text along with the Quran from which we take the fiqh. So we said the main factor in this time was the fact that the two schools of thought emerged in terms of fiqh. First one was in Iraq, mainly influenced by Abdullah bin Mas'ud, who was greatly influenced by Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu anhu. And then the Ahl Hadith school of thought in Medina, which was more dependent on hadith, and specifically Abdullah ibn Umar wa Abdullah ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhum ajma'in. That's the main distinguishing factor at that specific time. Some of the reasons why the Madrasat al-Ra'i, or the intellectual school of thought, emerged more in Iraq was, as we said first, the influence of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and the influence of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Because Ali ibn Abi Talib, radiyallahu anhu, faced extreme situations in Al-Kufa. So they had to deal with a lot of new situations, so he had to use a lot of ijtihad, a lot of reason. So the people of Kufa witnessed this and they saw how to deal with new affairs, so they were influenced greatly by this. Second, the number of hadith was less in Iraq due to the fact that in Medina most of the companions remained there and they taught their students. But in Iraq was a lesser number of companions in Iraq, so the number of hadith that was accessible to the people of Iraq was much less. So when they needed a solution about something, they needed a ruling about a situation, they had to look at what they had in their hands. So a lot of the hadith were not there, so they had to resort to al-ijtihad. The fact that Medina lived a very pure kind of life, Al-Hijaz, Mecca, Medina, they remained upon pretty much how the lifestyle of the Prophet ﷺ. They maintained that lifestyle. But in Iraq, a lot of the issues that were in Persia, originally in Persia, emerged. A lot of transactions, a lot of political situations, a lot of personal habits and customs and traditions. So there was a lot of new things to find rulings for and ijtihad. So there was a great need to use ijtihad. That was another reason. Also, Iraq was the bedrock of both the Shia and the Khawarij, and most of them settled there. So there were extreme situations there that people had to deal with, and there was a lot of arguments and discussions. So there was a need for more intellectual approach to things as well. Somebody might think that the scholars of hadith who followed the Madrasat al-Ra'i, the scholars who followed the Madrasat or the school of thought in Iraq, which was mainly based on intellectual reasoning and analogy, that they were indifferent when it came to hadith. But that wasn't the case. As we said, the number of hadith they had was less by virtue of the fact that lesser number of the companions were in Iraq. Number two, the scholars of Iraq had very stringent conditions to accept the hadith. They have very strict conditions on the narrators and the chains of narration. Why? Because mainly in Iraq there was a lot of the people of bid'ah, a lot of the Khawarij and a lot of the Shia, a lot of the Rafidah. And these people were making up hadith. Khawarij no, but the Shia yes. Were making up hadith to support their own stance, political stance or religious stance. There was a lot of making up of hadith. So the people of Iraq were very strict in accepting any hadith. They would study it thoroughly, and they would scrutinize the chain of narrations and the narrators, and they were so it wasn't easy for them to accept the hadith. As to the Madrasatu Ahl al-Hadith in Medina specifically and Hijaz in general, the reason why it was so, mainly they remained upon the same style of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Second thing, there was a huge number of companions living there, a huge number of companions and their children and their students, so there was no need for anything more than that. Life was very simple in Al-Hijaz. Lifestyle was very simple, and we said they maintained the originality that was there at the time of the Prophet ﷺ for the most part. So life was straight, quite simple. There was not political turmoil. You couldn't find a lot of new issues and multicultural diversity. That wasn't the case. So things were pretty straightforward. Also, there was no fitna there. There was no Rafida, there was no Khawarij, there was no new groups there. It was only people upon the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So there was no need for arguments, there was no need for clarifications, there was no need for reasoning, there was no need for dealing with hypothetical questions. Also, there was a general tendency that was averse to asking questions, hypothetical questions. As we said, Madrasat al-Ra'i in Iraq, the main catchphrase was أرأيت لو أرأيت, what if that happened, until they were called al-Ara'aytiyun. That was people in Hijaz would make fun of them. These are the ifs, or the what ifs. And they also emphasized hadith and the importance of hadith, and to stop by the hadith. That's it, without going any further. There was a lot of debate. There was a lot of debate between the two schools of thought, and sometimes it became aggressive. And the one who, to deal with this important debate and important difference, will come to us in the next phase, that was Imam al-Shafi'i. That was one of the points of excellence about Imam al-Shafi'i. He saw people in al-Hijaz who have the hadith. They have the Quran, they have the Sunnah, they have knowledge of the hadith, but they do not utilize the hadith fully in terms of extracting rulings from it. So they limit themselves to the apparent meaning, the literal meaning of the hadith. And sometimes he would see from among them people who would hold on to the literal meaning of the hadith, which might be contradictory to what was intended behind it, which is al-Zahiriyya. Okay? Those who stick with the literal meaning of the hadith, even if it goes against the real intent of the hadith. We'll come to those, inshallah, to deal with that. And then when he went to Iraq, he saw people who had profound understanding, very mature understanding, ability to analyze things, classify them, and deduce rulings and understandings and make connections and analogies, powerful tools. But these, they don't have enough content when it came to the hadith. So he said, these, in Medina need those, and those need these. So he wanted to combine both. And this was the renewal or tajdeed that Imam al-Shafi'i came with. Inshallah, we'll come to that in detail. And that kind of dichotomy remained even afterwards. Even later on, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi writes something about this kind of dichotomy between Ahl al-Ra'i and Ahl al-Hadith. And then he writes even, although he was one of the scholars of Hadith, Imam Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, he's the one who wrote the first book on Mustalah al-Hadith. He's the first one who wrote a book on Mustalah al-Hadith, the first one to write a book on Mustalah al-Hadith. His book is the main reference, is the main source. His famous book, Al-Faqih wal-Mutafaqih. He himself wrote a book to the people of Hadith. He said, Nasiha ila Ahl al-Hadith. Nasiha ila Ahl al-Hadith. We might mention it, inshallah, later on. Okay, that's the incident that I mentioned. Imam Malik narrated in his Muwatta from his teacher, his Shaykh Rabi'a. Rabi'a says, سألت سعيد ibn al-Musayyib. He asked Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, one of the greatest tabi'een in Medina, about an issue, about if someone accidentally cuts off the finger of another person. And that was specifically about a woman. Anyway, the ruling is a bit complicated to explain it here. But then he asks a question. He says, that and this, they don't match. So Sa'id ibn Musayyib told him, that's how the narration came. That's how the narration came. Then he he said, "Iraqiyun anta?" That's what Sa'id al-Musayyib said. Are you from Iraq? He knows him, he's not. But he's basically saying, you following their way? Are you from Iraq? He said, قال ربيعة بل عالم مستثبت. No, I'm just someone who really wants to make sure that what I'm learning makes sense. أو جاهل متعلم. Or I am considering me to be an ignorant who's trying to learn. فقال سعيد هي السنة. This is the narration. He's talking about a hadith that was reported by Nasa'i. So that was the incident we mentioned. It's in Muwatta al-Imam Malik. Now, in Medina, in Madrasat al-Hadith, we said there were 7 scholars who became known as, and this is a very important factor as well, or feature of this time, or this stage of fiqh. So we said the main feature, first main feature, was that there were 2 schools of thought that emerged, Madrasat al-Ra'i in Iraq and Madrasat al-Hadith in al-Hijaz, specifically Medina. Second feature is the al-Fuqaha al-Sab'ah. These are the main fuqaha who were well established and known in Medina, and everyone was seeking knowledge from them. They are from al-Tabi'een. First one, Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib. Well, I actually mentioned them before when I mentioned these scholars, but anyway. Second, Urwa ibn Zubayr. Abu Bakr bin Abd al-Rahman. Ubaydullah ibn Abdullah ibn Utbah. Ubaydullah ibn Abdullah ibn Utbah. Kharijah ibn Zayd ibn Thabit, the son of Zayd bin Thabit. Kharijah ibn Zayd ibn Thabit. والقاسم بن محمد ابن أبي بكر. القاسم بن محمد ابن أبي بكر, the grandson of Abu Bakr. وسليمان ابن يسار. Sulaiman ibn Yasar. These are 7. Not all the scholars are agreed about these 7. There's a dispute. There are 2 of them that some scholars say, no, these are not. They will take out 2 of those and put other 2 instead of them. They would put Aban ibn Uthman ibn Affan, the son of Uthman ibn Affan, Aban ibn Uthman ibn Affan. And they would put Salim ibn Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of Abdullah ibn Umar, Salim. But there's also other great scholars at the time in Medina. The brother of Salim, Abdullah ibn Abdullah ibn Umar. These are 2 sons of Abdullah ibn Umar, Abdullah and Salim. And there is Abu Salma ibn Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, the son of the companion Abdul Rahman ibn Auf. And there was Ali ibn al-Husayn ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, the son of al-Husayn. Ali was in Medina, became one of the notable scholars. And there is Nafi' Mawla Umar, famous student of Abdullah bin Umar, Nafi' al-Madani. So these were specifically in Medina. The scholars of Al-Kufa, specifically the students of Abdullah bin Mas'ud, in Kufa, the number of companions who settled in Al-Kufa was 300 companions. 300 companions. Obviously, that's almost insignificant compared to Medina. There was thousands in Medina. The scholars of Al-Kufa, since we're talking about these 2 schools, the Medina, we mentioned them, Madrasat al-Hadith, Madrasat al-Ra'i, among the great scholars of them, Alqamah ibn Qais al-Nakha'i. علقمة ابن قيس النخعي والأسود ابن يزيد النخعي وأبو ميسرة عمرو ابن شراحيل الهمداني. By the way, you don't have to memorize these names. I'm just mentioning them so you get to know them. You want to write them down? Fine. أبو ميسرة عمرو ابن شراحيل الهمداني ومسروق ابن الأجدع الهمداني وشريح ibn al-Harith al-Kindi. The knowledge of all those later on ended up with Abu Hanifa. The knowledge of the ones in Medina slowly, obviously went to their students, then Imam Malik. Because that paves the way for us, inshallah, with the next stage, to see how the madhahib started to emerge and develop. So generally speaking, this is the stage, as we said, between 40, the year 40 after Hijrah, until around 120, around that time, 120. Not much happened in Medina. The same style that we find among the Khulafa al-Rashidun was maintained, which is Madrasat al-Hadith. But we find the style of Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu anhu, his approach to fiqh, and the approach of Abdullah bin Mas'ud, which was more open, I would say more open to ijtihad and reasoning and seeing the wisdoms behind the rulings, behind the text. Okay. This also developed and became more apparent in Iraq. And it shows, now we have two mainstreams among the Muslim Ummah when it comes to fiqh. We have Madrasat al-Hadith holding on to the text strictly, and if anything requires something else, they would be very hesitant. Most of the time they would not give a fatwa. And we have the other school of thought that is more, as we say, is more open, more liberal when it comes to ijtihad. So they would see what is the wisdom behind the text. They would make connections between rulings. This is very important because this will shape how fiqh will develop later on. And until today, we have people who emphasize the hadith, the literal meaning of the hadith, and they hold on to it. And anything that departs from it, they would be very cautious and resistant to it. They would show a lot of resistance. But we have what is more today, you will find it mainly with the usuliyun, those who are more linked to usul al-fiqh, and they would basically see what's behind the rulings. What is the system that's holding fiqh together, that's behind this? What are the wisdoms, the maqasid, the objectives of Sharia? And they would use this kind of reasoning. And any of you who's going to study on their research, do their paper on any ruling, like for example, some of you will be talking about the beard, some will be talking about resembling the non-Muslims, tashabbuh, some will be talking about, I think someone was going to talk about isbal, we're talking about issues of riba and mortgage. What did you say we'll be talking about? Automated slaughter. You're going to see features of these. Those who will say it has to be literal, those who would see, what's the maqasid, what's the objectives, what's the meanings behind these. And okay, so they would see the patterns in the Sharia and the system that's running and holding the Sharia together. So you'll find these two schools of thought. So you can look at them as one continuum. So you don't have to be either here or there. Some people are somewhere in the middle. So we have Madrasat al-Hadith here, holding on literally. Sometimes it gets extreme to the point of al-Zahiriyya. Al-Zahiriyya, we mentioned previously, they hold on to the literal sense, even though it doesn't make sense. These are called al-Zahiriyya. And as we said, remember, those who Prophet ﷺ prohibited urinating in still water. So for them, they said you can't urinate directly, but if you urinate in a container, then pour that in the pond, that's fine. That's extreme. But we have on the other side, Then we have more to the middle, we have Ahl al-Hadith who hold on to the text. And then we have, some of them are leaning more towards the usul and more towards the ra'i. So they would look at the text and they would combine it with others and they would see what's behind that. And then you would have people more on the side of a ra'i, so they would take more liberty from the texts on trying to hold on to the meanings. And then you will find on the far extreme people who would give no regard to the texts at all. No regard to the text at all. And for them it's just opinion. Whatever is beneficial, whatever seems to be beneficial, whatever, a pragmatic approach, completely pragmatic approach. So this is a continuum. It helps you see all of these spectrums together. All of these spectrums. Ibn al-Qayyim, very interestingly, Imam al-Qayyim in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in, he actually, there's a very clear pattern when he talks about the fiqh and how it developed in the madhahib. He actually talks about something, and I hope I'll be able to translate it to English meaningfully. He says, بعض الفقهاء يغلب الألفاظ وبعضهم يغلب المعاني. Some of the fuqaha emphasize more the wordings and the literal sense. And some of the fuqaha emphasize more the meanings. So those would sacrifice the words sometimes for the sake of holding the meanings. And those would sacrifice the meanings for the sake of the words. So when he even talks about the madhahib, he says madhab أبي حنيفة ومذهب مالك يغلبان المعاني على الألفاظ. So the madhab Abu Hanifa, madhab Imam Malik, they give emphasis to the meanings more than the literal words. More than the literal words. And that makes sense because madhab Abu Hanifa originated in Iraq from Ahl al-Ra'i. Then he says مذهب الشافعي ومذهب أحمد يغلبان الألفاظ على المعاني. مذهب Imam Shafi'i, مذهب Imam Ahmad, the Hanbali, they emphasize the words and the literal sense over the meanings. He says فالحق الحق موائمة الألفاظ والمعاني. He says the truth is found when we combine the meanings and the words and the literal sense. So he says if we can find always in every case, in every scenario, the middle ground between the meanings and the words, that's where the truth is. And that's a very profound statement, by the way. And you can see it through his book, through I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in. It's quite clear. If you see it as a pattern, now you can see it. But it takes time to really figure that out when you're going through the book. But that's a very important thing. That's a very important thing. So there's always some kind of contention between meanings and words. Meanings and words. Balance is where the truth lies. It's that kind of balance. So this should help us at our times to deal with this. So generally speaking, that's the stage. It's quite easy, straightforward, not much about it. The next stage, which inshallah will be around 120, 130 after Hijrah, and will cover the time of the four madhahib. And not, by the way, the madhahib were many, but these are the ones who survived. But there was a lot of other madhahib, and they were common, and they were practiced, but these are the ones who remained until this day. So we will see how they developed, inshallah. But now we're seeing they are in the making now. Now they are in the making at this stage. But soon, inshallah, we'll see how they took that turn with Abu Hanifa and Malik, rahimahumullah. And then later on, we'll see how Shafi'i dealt with this dichotomy of Ahl al-Hadith and Ahl al-Ra'i, and how he tried to reconcile and find this middle ground. And then we'll see how Imam Ahmad came and built upon what Shafi'i had, along with what he learned from his teachers of al-Hadith, and how Imam Ahmad was a bridging point between the science of Hadith and the science of Fiqh. Science of Hadith and science of Fiqh. Because Imam Ahmad is one of the greatest muhaddithin and one of the greatest fuqaha. And that's a unique thing. That's a unique thing. So one of the main books of Hadith that we have in Islam is Musnad al-Imam Ahmad. And one of the main sources of fiqh we have is madhab al-Imam Ahmad. So Imam Ahmad stands in the middle point between these two giant sciences. So that was a point of excellence for Imam Ahmad. And he was from the mukthirin in hadith. Like he narrates more than 28,000 unique hadiths in his musnad. That's such a huge collection. Such a huge collection. Even among the scholars of hadith, that's a huge, powerful collection. And with fiqh, like he has a detailed madhab. He has a detailed madhab, and with a lot of the issues in the madhab, he has two opinions. That means he's gone through a lot of stages in his madhab. So we'll inshallah try to get as much as possible. I kept this this stage short, because not much really happened there, apart from what we mentioned. But we will need to see how the madhab evolves, because that's going to give us a lot of insight, and we need to understand it. It's very important for our times, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Barakallahu feekum wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.